Story 1. The Cabin That Whispered at Midnight. I remember the snow hitting my windshield like shards of glass, each flake catching the dim glow of my headlights as if mocking my attempts to press forward. My car had slid into a shallow ditch, the tires spinning uselessly against the ice. I had no signal, no way to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away, buried somewhere beneath the storm. I thought about waiting it out in the car, but the cold was creeping through the cracks and the heater was failing fast. I needed shelter. Through the blur of white, a faint warm light flickered in the distance. At first, I thought it was another stranded motorist or maybe a house on the far edge of the road, but as I trudged through the knee-deep snow, I realized it was a cabin half buried in ice and snow, leaning slightly as if it had grown crooked with age. Relief washed over me, a mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope. The door was unlocked, and I pushed it open with trembling hands. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, the smell of damp wood and decay lingering faintly. The fireplace was empty, no embers, just a cold, black cavity. I collapsed onto a threadbare rug, shivering, grateful simply to be out of the storm. Hours passed, though I couldn't be sure how many. I kept hearing it at first as a subtle hum, like the wind threading through cracks in the walls. Then it became whispering, soft but deliberate, echoing through the cabin. At first I told myself it was the wind, the storm speaking in voices only I could hear, but the whispers turned into something more coherent, or at least something I thought I could make out. Soft, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize, almost teasing, almost threatening. I froze whenever the words came near, afraid to move, afraid that any sound of my own would provoke whatever was speaking. I tried to leave, pushed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Each time I thought I had it, the door seemed further away, like the cabin had shifted when my back was turned. Panic clawed at me. I paced the small room, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, that the snowstorm outside had scrambled my senses. But the scratches on the floorboards told another story. I noticed them the next time I woke from a fitful nap, long, shallow marks as if someone or something had been pacing behind me while I slept. I dared not look directly, but the air seemed to press against my back, cold and watchful. I spent the night in uneven, broken sleep, the whispering ebbing and flowing like it had its own rhythm, patient and relentless. Morning came, though it offered little comfort. The storm had passed, leaving a bright, blinding light reflected off the pristine snow. I expected to see the road, the familiar curve that led back to civilization, but it wasn't there. In its place was a forest that stretched endlessly, trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. My heart sank. I stumbled forward, hoping to catch any familiar landmark, any sign of the highway. The cabin stood behind me, silent now, ordinary in the daylight, but I could feel it lingering. Some unspoken presence pressed against my mind. I kept walking, moving until exhaustion forced me to stop, and even then, I could swear I heard faint murmurings carried on the cold breeze, words just out of reach, echoing from the trees. Hours later, I finally emerged onto the highway, disoriented and numb, but even there, the memory of the cabin clung to me, a shadow that refused to lift. At home, the whispers followed in dreams, in the quiet moments when the wind outside my window carried no sound at all. I would hear them softly, unintelligible, but insistent, like a memory of something I couldn't quite remember but should never forget. I have never returned to that forest, never sought the cabin again, and yet, in the deepest, quietest parts of winter, I find myself imagining its walls closing in, feeling the cold air press against me, and wondering if it had really been a place at all. or if it had been waiting for someone to stumble blindly into its shadow. Even now, years later, I feel the weight of that night whenever snow falls heavily, when the wind howls through empty spaces. I know it sounds foolish, but there's a part of me that still expects to see the faint glow of that cabin, just beyond the bend of the road, whispering my name in a language I cannot comprehend. And I know that if I ever did, I might not resist going back. The memory of the scratches on the floor, the cold air pressing insistently, the shifting door, it has stayed with me, and I fear it always will. The cabin doesn't end at the clearing. It doesn't vanish when the storm does. It lingers in the mind, in the quiet, in the relentless hum of the wind, waiting for the next lost soul to mistake warmth for safety. I could never explain what happened there, and I don't think anyone would believe me, but the whispers remain, just at the edge of hearing, persistent, patient, like an echo from some place outside the world I know. Even as I tell this story now, sitting in the safety of my home, I feel a shiver crawl across my spine. I remember the way the walls seemed to lean in, how the air itself felt sentient, and the way the cabin seemed to shift whenever I turned my back. I can't shake it, and maybe, deep down, I don't want to. Story 2, Footsteps Across the Frozen Creek. I remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. My friend and I had decided to hike along the frozen creek, thinking it would be a quiet escape from the world, a chance to leave the city and the noise behind. The snow had fallen heavy the night before, covering the forest in thick, muffling white. The creek itself was frozen solid, though the ice groaned ominously under our boots with every step. The trees stood tall and still, stripped of their leaves, their branches reaching toward the grey sky like fingers. At first, the only sounds were our own breathing and the occasional snap of a brittle branch underfoot. It felt peaceful, almost beautiful in a desolate, untouched sort of way. We took turns calling out, trying to break the oppressive silence that seemed to wrap itself around us like a cold, damp blanket. I remember the echo of my voice bouncing off the trees and ice, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the forest was listening, like it was waiting for something. And then it happened. We froze mid-step, our voices cutting off, hearts suddenly hammering in our chests. Footsteps, heavier than ours, deliberate and slow, echoed from somewhere behind us on the ice. They were perfectly timed with our movements, almost as if the sounds were mimicking the rhythm of our steps. We spun around, eyes straining through the grey light and thick, bare branches, but there was nothing there. The trees were empty, silent, mocking in their stillness. My friend laughed nervously, a hollow sound that did little to calm me. Probably just an animal, he said, though even he sounded unsure of his own words. But I felt it, something was there, moving closer whenever we paused, always just behind us, unseen. The ice beneath our feet groaned again, echoing with a weight that wasn't ours. At first, I told myself it was imagination, that the wind or the settling ice was playing tricks on me, but the timing was too precise, too intentional. Every time we stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time we moved, they resumed, always in perfect sync with us, like someone, or something, was walking right behind, watching our every step. The light grew dimmer as the afternoon wore on, and the forest began to feel less familiar. I suggested we turn back, trying to sound casual, but even as we retraced our steps, I noticed the trees shifting in ways they hadn't before, the path curving oddly. Unfamiliar landmarks where I swore there had been none. Panic began to creep into my chest, slow and gnawing, as though the forest itself were rearranging, closing in on us. My friend pressed on, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, but I could feel the weight of eyes on us, patient and relentless. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the frozen creek, the brittle trees, and that oppressive silence, punctuated only by the footsteps that never left us. We walked faster, the snow crunching sharply under our boots, and yet the rhythm of those steps never faltered, never broke. At one point, I stopped completely, forcing my friend to do the same, and the footsteps ceased as well. I held my breath, every nerve on edge, and then, slowly, we moved again, and they followed, step for step, exactly where we went. I wanted to call out, to shout, to break whatever hold this thing had over us, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no reason for fear, I told myself, yet my stomach churned with the certainty that we were not alone, that the forest had chosen to play a cruel game with us. The sun was beginning to set when we finally broke through to the main trail, the familiar line of the old hiking path offering a small, fragile comfort. We looked around frantically, expecting to see someone, or something, catching up to us, but the forest appeared as empty and still as it had when we entered. No footprints marred the snow behind us, no signs that anything had been tracking us all afternoon. My friend laughed it off again, nervous and tense, but I could still feel it, a lingering presence, something patient and deliberate, like the echo of those footsteps had followed me home, lingering in my mind long after the forest faded from view. Even now, years later, I can hear them sometimes when I walk alone at night. Not loud, not intrusive, just faint. Almost imperceptible steps that match my own, as though someone is silently tracing my path, patient and quiet, waiting for the exact moment I become aware. I have tried to rationalize it. Old houses with creaking floors, the mind playing tricks. But it never feels like imagination. It always feels real. The memory is etched into me, the oppressive silence, the groaning ice, the way the forest seemed to shift subtly when we looked away. I've avoided the creek entirely since that day, and I warn anyone who will listen not to go there in the winter alone. The forest has a strange, patient memory. It watches, it waits, and sometimes it leaves echoes behind. Footprints you can't see but can feel in the rhythm of your own steps, carrying a quiet reminder that some places are not meant to be walked, at least not by the living. Even as I tell this story now, I feel the faintest pressure on my heels, and I know it will never truly leave me. The sound is subtle, almost polite in its persistence, but it is there, counting my steps, mirroring my movements. Like the frozen creek and the empty forest never truly let us go. Story 3. The snow-covered barn of shadows. I was driving home one late afternoon, the sky a dull grey, and the snow had been falling steadily all day. The road was quiet, empty, stretching endlessly across frozen fields, and the trees were heavy with frost, bowing as if weighed down by some unseen burden. My headlights barely pierced the thickening dusk, and I felt a strange sense of isolation, like I was the only living thing for miles. That's when I saw it, a barn, completely covered in snow, standing alone in a field that stretched on in all directions. There were no tracks leading to it, no signs of life, and yet it was somehow compelling, almost impossible to ignore. I pulled over, stepping carefully through the snow toward it, my boots sinking into the drifts. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. The barn door creaked when I pushed it open, and a wave of frigid air hit me, smelling faintly of damp wood and something more unpleasant. Something decaying, though nothing appeared rotten at first glance. The floor was layered in dust and frost, and the dim light from outside barely illuminated the space. I took slow steps inside, my breath misting in front of me, and for a moment the barn seemed ordinary. But then I noticed the shadows. They weren't normal shadows cast by the weak winter light. They flickered along the walls, long and distorted, moving even when I stopped. stretching and twisting like they had a life of their own. My rational mind fought to explain it. Flickering light, uneven snow outside my imagination. But the unease crawling up my spine told me it wasn't that simple. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. Soft at first, almost drowned out by the wind, but then clearer, raspy and deliberate. My name, whispered. I froze, my stomach knotting, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some echo bouncing through the barn. But the voice called again, low and insistent. I stumbled backward, panic bubbling in my chest, toward the door. That's when I realized the weight of the snow outside had somehow pressed the doors shut, sealing me inside. I pushed and shoved, but the doors wouldn't give. The whispering grew, circling me, almost tangible, like it was moving around me in the dark corners of the barn. I felt its presence, patient, deliberate, waiting. The shadows seemed to respond to my fear, stretching longer, dark shapes pooling at the edges of my vision. I tried to look directly at them, to confront whatever it was, but my eyes refused to focus. The whispers continued, muttering words I couldn't understand, unintelligible and harsh, curling around me, pressing against my chest. My breathing came in short, panicked bursts. I ran to the far corner of the barn, pushing my hands against the walls, desperate for anything solid, anything to hold on to. The air was cold enough to burn my lungs, and the floorboards beneath my feet groaned under the strain of my movement. Minutes, hours, time had no meaning there. Eventually, gathering every ounce of strength, I forced the doors open. Snow tumbling inside with a rush of cold wind. I fell forward into the drifts, rolling in the powder, gasping, my heart hammering as if it would burst. When I looked back, the barn stood silent, empty, ordinary. The snow had settled around it as if it had never been disturbed. There was no shadow, no whisper, no trace of the weight pressing against me. Just a cold field, the road stretching onward, and the lingering memory of what had been inside. I stumbled back to my car, shaking, unable to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it. Tiredness, nerves, the strange interplay of light and snow. But the memory of the whispering, the shadows moving when they shouldn't, the pressure of something unseen circling me, stayed with me. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark shape following, moving silently over the snow. But there was nothing, only the grey of winter and the soft, endless silence of the fields. Even now, years later, every time I pass that stretch of road in winter, I feel the same tightening in my chest, the same uneasy pull that warns me to keep driving, keep moving, and never stop. I've told people about it, and most have shrugged it off, calling it a trick of light or overactive imagination. I don't argue. I don't want them to think it's real, but I know it is. I can still see the way those shadows twisted along the barn walls, feel the rasp of my name against my ear, and remember the cold pressing against me as I fought to escape. It isn't something I can explain. There was no door ajar, no animals, no wind patterns that could have carried sound so deliberately. There was only the barn, the snow, and the sense of being watched, of being contained in a space that obeyed some logic I could not understand. That feeling, the quiet, deliberate presence, stays with me, a weight in my chest whenever I think of it. I have walked the road a dozen times since, and though the barn appears ordinary from the distance, I cannot stop the memory from pressing against me, a lingering fear that whatever was inside that winter field is patient, waiting, and perhaps still moving unseen among the shadows. Some nights I dream of it, the long walls, the dark corners stretching toward me, whispering my name, circling patiently, just out of reach. I wake with the memory of cold air biting my lungs, heart hammering, and the faintest feeling that it never really let me go. It has never let me go. I do not know what it was, and I do not know why it called me there, but I know that I cannot pass that road without a shiver running down my spine, without the instinct to keep moving, keep my eyes on the road, and never, ever stop to look too closely. Story 4. The Hollowed Cabin in the Pines. We had been hunting all day, trudging through heavy snow in the thick pines, the forest so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. My friends and I were part of a small winter trip, expecting quiet and isolation, but nothing had prepared me for what we found. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked between tall, snow-laden pines, as if it had grown there naturally, hidden from the world. It looked abandoned, yet perfectly intact. Its logs sturdy, the windows unbroken, the roof weighed down with fresh snow but holding firm. It was uncanny. Like someone had paused life inside the cabin and left it frozen for us to discover. We shrugged off the unease and settled in for the night, lighting a small fire in the hearth, though the wood was damp and smoked more than it warmed. Outside, the wind cut through the trees in sharp gusts, and the pines groaned under the weight of the snow, but inside, it seemed safe, quiet, almost comforting. Night fell hard and fast. The fire died low, leaving shadows dancing against the walls. I woke suddenly to soft tapping at the window, irregular but deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the muffled breathing of my friends, all fast asleep. The tapping came again, faint but insistent, echoing through the stillness of the cabin. Heart hammering, I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The moonlight filtered through the trees, catching on shapes that shifted just beyond the frost-coated glass. I couldn't see faces, just blurry figures standing between the pines, unmoving, watching. I wanted to call out, to demand they go away, but no sound escaped my lips. My rational mind kept repeating that it was the cold, or shadows, or imagination fueled by fatigue, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I returned to bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Yet the tapping continued, now accompanied by something worse. A faint, ragged breathing from inside the cabin, low and deliberate. I dared not turn to look, but I could sense it moving, patient and deliberate, waiting somewhere in the darkness. My friends remained asleep, oblivious, and I wanted to wake them, but the sound felt too intimate, too singular. I lay there, stiff and trembling, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the wind, or my own breathing echoing back at me, but the rational explanations failed to settle my growing dread. Morning brought no relief. The snow outside lay thick and untouched, pristine, without footprints. No sign that anyone or anything had been outside the cabin. It was impossible. The tapping and the breathing had been real. I was certain of it. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself the forest had its own tricks, that the long shadows and shifting light had played on my imagination. But I couldn't ignore the lingering sense of eyes pressing through the walls, following my movements, patient and waiting. Even as we broke camp and trudged back through the heavy pines, I could feel the presence behind me, somewhere in the stillness of the forest, watching, waiting for the dark of night to return. That night, back in my own bed, I couldn't sleep. I imagined the cabin frozen in the pines, unmoving, silent, yet alive in some subtle way I couldn't explain. And when I closed my eyes, I could still hear it, the soft tapping, the low ragged breathing, almost a whisper, but no words, no shape, just that unrelenting, patient attention. Over the following nights, I would catch the sensation again, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the weight of someone's gaze pressed against my back. I became wary of the woods, wary of the quiet spaces where nothing seems to move. The memory of that cabin never faded, a stubborn shadow at the edges of thought. a presence that didn't belong anywhere I could reach. I told my friends what I felt, and they laughed, dismissing it as nerves, snow-induced hallucinations, or the strain of hunting in the dead of winter. But they couldn't convince me otherwise. I knew what I had seen, or what I had felt, and rationalizations did little to soothe the tension that had burrowed into my chest. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of branches outside a window felt like a reminder that the hollowed cabin was still out there, unchanged, patient, waiting. Its silence weighed more heavily than any sound I had ever heard. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself imagining that cabin again, nestled between the frost-heavy pines, shadows moving silently within, unbroken, unchanging. I can hear the tap against the glass and the slow, deliberate breathing, as if the forest itself had marked the cabin as a place between moments, a frozen slice of time that watches, always. I have no reason to return, no desire to seek it out. Yet the memory lingers in ways that feel almost alive, tugging at the edges of thought whenever the wind rises in winter, carrying the faintest whispers through the bare trees. I never found the source of the sounds, nor any trace that anyone else had been there. And that is what unsettles me most. There was no evidence, no clue, nothing tangible to grasp onto, only the persistent, patient presence that I could feel pressing against my mind. I still feel it sometimes, long after the pines have disappeared behind snow and hills, and I know that it waits, always, in the hollow spaces of winter forests, in the quiet of abandoned cabins, watching, waiting, and never letting go. Story 5. The Frozen Attic Door That Creaked. I had been staying at my uncle's cabin deep in the mountains for a week, hoping to escape the city and the constant hum of noise. It was winter, and the roads were slick with ice, the trees heavy with snow, bending toward the earth as though weighed down by their own silence. The cabin itself was isolated, a simple structure of weathered logs and a steep roof, perched on a rise overlooking a frozen creek. Inside, it smelled of old pine, wood smoke, and the faint tang of mildew in corners where the cold seeped through. I had explored most of the cabin by then. Every creaking floorboard, every frost-laced window, but the attic remained locked, a door at the top of a narrow staircase that had never opened for me. Curiosity gnawed at me more than once, whispering that there was something there I had to see. One evening, when the house was silent and my relatives were absorbed in the warm glow of the hearth, I returned to that door and with a grunt, forced it open. Cold air rushed out immediately, sharper than anything in the rest of the house, carrying the faint, musty smell of mildew and something else I couldn't place. Pine, yes, but mixed with an almost iron-like tang that made my stomach twist. The hinges groaned in protest. And as I pushed the door wide, the shadows inside the attic seemed to shift, as if exhaling the darkness itself. I paused at the threshold, heart hammering, then stepped up the narrow staircase. Each creak of the floorboards under my weight seemed loud, impossibly loud, in the thick silence of the cabin. I paused mid-step, listening, and for a moment there was only the wind sighing through the eaves and the soft tick of the radiator below. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. Movement, subtle but unmistakable. Shadows sliding along the walls, bending and stretching like liquid. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, a frozen block of panic that refused to move. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light, the angle of the moonlight through the small attic window, or fatigue pressing at the edges of perception, but the unease crawling along my spine felt too real. I wasn't alone. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, straining to catch more than glimpses of the darkness that now seemed to watch me back. The door slammed shut behind me with a suddenness that made me jump so violently I stumbled over the top step. My hands went to the doorknob, twisting desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The cold pressed in. and the shadows seemed to stretch further, lengthening across the walls with deliberate slowness, circling me, patient, almost curious in their movements. I could feel the attic itself breathing around me, alive with the presence of something unseen. I held my breath, afraid that any noise would draw attention, afraid that my very existence had been detected by whatever lingered in the corners. The shadows moved silently, obeying no light, no shape, yet their motions were deliberate, circling, waiting. My lungs burned from holding my breath, and the silence was heavier than I could have imagined, pressing into my chest and rattling my nerves with each creak of the boards. Time lost meaning, minutes or hours I couldn't tell, until finally I could bear it no longer. I exhaled sharply and lunged for the door, twisting and pulling until the hinges groaned and the latch finally gave way. I tumbled out of the attic, tripping down the steps, and landed hard on the wooden floor below. My relatives didn't stir, the fire still low in the hearth, the cabin warm and normal, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, or if my mind had conjured the shadows out of some primal fear, but the feeling of being watched, of something patient and deliberate circling just beyond perception, remained. I left the door ajar this time, though I knew I wouldn't return. Even outside the attic, the memory followed me. I would feel it in the corners of my vision, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the wind pressed cold against the windows and the cabin seemed to exhale with some hidden life of its own. I became conscious of every movement in the house, every shifting shadow cast by the firelight, every creak in the floorboards. The memory of those slithering shapes, their slow, deliberate patience, was imprinted on me. A reminder that the cabin held spaces beyond my understanding, places where light and reason could not reach. When I finally left the mountains, driving back along snow-crusted roads, I carried the sensation with me. I would catch glimpses of shadows at the edge of my vision in other homes, in the corners of hotel rooms, in any space that felt too quiet, too still. The attic had left its imprint, and I could not shake it. Even now I feel the cold rush, the subtle pressure of unseen eyes when I close my door at night, and I know it is the same patience that watched me from that frozen attic, circling silently, waiting. I have never returned to that cabin, nor have I tried to justify what I felt up there. Some things resist explanation, and I've learned to respect that. But I can still recall the taste of the cold air, the smell of mildew and pine, the way the shadows moved as if they were alive and aware. I know they were not figments of imagination entirely, not while the memory clings to me with the weight of certainty. It is quiet, patient, never threatening outright, but persistent, leaving a hollow space inside me that I cannot fill. Even now, years later, I sense it whenever I enter an unfamiliar attic, or a quiet room with heavy shadows pressed against the corners. My pulse quickens, my skin prickles, and I remember the frozen attic door that creaked under my hand, the air that smelled of decay and pine, and the shadows that moved with a strange, patient curiosity. The memory is with me always, a quiet echo that follows in the dark, a reminder that some places, even in the warmth of daytime, are never truly empty, and that the eyes of the unseen linger long after we've fled. Story 6. The lantern flicker on black roads. The snow was falling so thick that the world outside my windshield had melted into a blur of white and grey. The headlights of my car cutting only a narrow path through the storm. I had been driving for hours, the back roads home winding through the hills and pines, and the silence of the storm pressed against me like a living thing. The radio had gone out somewhere along the way, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the tires against the icy asphalt. I remember gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, eyes straining through the storm. When I saw it, a faint flicker ahead, like a lantern swinging in the distance. At first, I thought it might be another driver, someone walking along the side of the road, but as I slowed, no figure appeared. Just the light, moving with a rhythm that felt deliberate, like someone was pacing the shoulder just beyond the snow. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again it seemed closer, though the time it took for me to cover the distance hadn't changed. My heart began to pound in my chest, a tight, frantic beat. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, the reflection of my own headlights bouncing off the wet snow. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I couldn't look away. The lantern flickered again, swinging gently, and my mind tried to rationalize its motion. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone stranded, but every instinct in me screamed that something was off. I tried to speed up, shake the feeling, put distance between myself and whatever, or whoever it was. But the light appeared again in my rearview mirror, always just beyond my reach, always moving in a way that seemed aware of me. The road itself began to twist unnaturally. I knew these back roads well, but tonight they curved in ways I didn't remember. Dips in the asphalt hidden under drifts of snow, snowbanks where there had never been any. I forced myself to focus on the wheel, to keep the car straight, but every turn seemed to bring the lantern closer, flickering just at the edge of vision, a pale, swaying light that didn't belong to any human source. The wind howled around the car, tugging at the doors and rattling the mirrors, but there was something else too, something patient, almost silent, that seemed to press against the car, following my every move. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the storm and isolation had made my mind unreliable, but the lantern's motion was too deliberate, too precise, responding to my pace, my hesitation. At one point, I braked sharply, heart racing, and the light slowed as if it was waiting for me, then surged forward the moment I moved again. It felt alive, intelligent, patient. The forest lining the road was thick and dark, and the snow muffled everything except the subtle crunch beneath my tires and the eerie flicker ahead. Every instinct screamed to stop, to turn around, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly behind me, twisting in impossible ways. Snow piling where I knew none should be, leading me onward towards something I couldn't name. By the time I recognized the familiar markers of my own driveway, the storm had begun to lighten, though the air was still cold and thick with snow. I breathed a little easier, thinking I had finally outrun whatever had been following me, but the lantern was gone. There was no figure, no source, nothing in the driveway or along the roadside. My relief was short-lived. As I shifted the car into park, I noticed that the headlights had dulled, frozen into a weak, almost lifeless glow. It was as if some unseen weight had pressed against them all the way home, leeching their light, leaving the car half blind in the dim winter afternoon. I remember sitting there for a long time, hands still gripping the wheel, heart hammering, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a trick of the storm, a reflection of my own lights in the drifting snow. Maybe I had imagined the path twisting beneath me, the snow piling where it shouldn't. But even as I stepped out, the cold biting through my coat, I felt it, the lingering sense of presence, patient and deliberate, something that had traveled with me the entire way. The headlight's dim glow was a reminder, a small, quiet trace of whatever had accompanied me along those black roads, invisible but undeniably there. Inside the house, the warmth of the fire did little to chase away the memory. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that flicker of lantern, that subtle sway of light moving in response to me. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by the faintest echo of swaying light, the knowledge that something had followed me, had waited, had been patient enough to walk beside me without ever showing itself. Each time I close my eyes, I see it again, the lantern just beyond reach, swaying as if swinging from invisible hands, patient, quiet, watching, waiting. Even now, whenever I drive alone on back roads in winter, I sense it. The subtle shift of shadows, the way the snow piles in places that shouldn't, the quiet pressure in the air that feels almost sentient. I've told friends, tried to explain it, and most dismiss it as imagination, tiredness, storm illusions. I don't argue. I can still feel the rhythm of its presence, just at the edges of perception, a reminder that some roads are never truly empty, some nights are never truly quiet, and some lights, flickering, patient, deliberate, follow long after you think you are alone. Story 7. The Frozen River and the Silent Figure. I had been up before sunrise that morning, trudging across the frozen river with my ice fishing gear, the air sharp enough to sting my cheeks and ears. The snow crunched underfoot, crisp and unbroken except for the shallow tracks I left behind. I found a promising spot near a bend in the river where the current ran just beneath the thick ice, making for a good catch. The sky was a pale grey, and the wind swept across the river in gusts that rattled my shanty and carried the faint scent of pine from the trees lining the banks. I drilled my hole, dropped my line in, and settled onto my folding chair, grateful for the solitude. Fishing had always been a way to escape the endless noise of life, to be left alone with my thoughts and the rhythm of nature. But that morning, I was not as alone as I thought. I noticed the figure first as a faint, dark shape on the far side of the river, motionless, standing at the edge of the ice like some shadow frozen in place. I squinted against the glare of the snow, assuming it was another fisherman, though that seemed unlikely given the hour. I waved, lifting my gloved hand high, and called out, but the wind swallowed my words, carrying them away before they could reach the figure. It didn't move. Its posture was unnerving, too rigid, too deliberate, as if it had been standing there for hours, unmoving, watching. I tried to convince myself it was just someone passing through, or that my eyes were playing tricks in the snow's reflection, but there was something about the stillness that made my stomach tighten. I went about my fishing, though my attention kept drifting to the figure. Hours passed, the sun barely rising above the distant tree line, and still it stayed, a dark, silent shape against the expanse of white. I caught a few fish, enough to keep me busy. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of some unspoken presence pressing across the frozen river toward me. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the ice, yet the figure remained isolated, separate, utterly unmoving. It was unnatural in its stillness, a thing that did not belong to the ordinary rhythms of the world. When I finally decided to pack up, the wind had picked up, and the sky was clouding over in muted greys, pressing the world into silence. I looked one last time across the river, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure hadn't moved. It remained fixed, a dark, solid outline against the fading snow. And I realized with a sudden, cold panic that there were no signs of life around it. No fishing gear, no footprints, nothing but the snow pressed flat beneath its unseen feet. My own tracks crunched behind me as I made my way to the riverbank, and that's when I noticed the footprints, a single trail leading from the figure toward the tree line, deep and crisp in the snow, but none leading back to the river. It was as if it had walked to the edge of the woods and simply vanished. Driving home that evening, the road slick with ice and the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through bare branches. I couldn't shake the image of the figure. My mind raced with explanations. Someone lost, a hunter, an optical illusion, but nothing fit. The stillness of it, the way it had watched without a twitch or sound, pressed into my thoughts with a weight I could not ignore. I felt eyes following me even as I left the river far behind, a lingering presence that refused to release its hold. That night, I dreamed of the figure. It stood again on the frozen river, dark and unyielding against the snow, unmoving, silent. I walked toward it in the dream, my feet crunching in the hard ice, but no matter how close I got, it did not react. The wind carried my voice away, my words never reaching it, and a cold dread settled in my chest, heavy and unshakable. I woke at dawn, sweat damp against the thin blanket, the memory of that still shape etched into my mind as though it had burned itself onto my eyelids. Even in the following days, the image lingered. I would catch glimpses of dark shapes at the edges of frozen ponds, or shadows in the tree line when the snow lay thick and untouched, and my heart would tighten with the same unease I felt by the river. I could almost feel the weight of the figure's gaze pressing across the ice, patient, deliberate, waiting. Friends laughed when I tried to explain it, called it the tricks of light on snow, or my imagination running wild, but they didn't feel it. They hadn't been there, standing alone on the ice with the wind slicing through their coat and the silent, immovable shape staring back at them. I returned to the river once, months later, after the thaw had melted most of the ice, curious if I could reconcile the memory with reality. But the spot was ordinary, the forest still, and the water flowing silently beneath a thin layer of ice. Yet even then, I could feel it, a ghostly echo of the presence that had stood there, patient and silent, marking the world in ways I could not see. The footprints remained etched in my memory, a trail leading to nowhere, proof that what I had seen had been real, and proof that some part of it still lingered, watching. Now, years later, whenever I walk along frozen rivers or peer into the shadows of the tree line on a quiet winter morning, I catch myself glancing for that dark shape. I know it will not be there, that the world is not so deliberately haunted, yet the memory persists, patient and unyielding. It waits in the corners of my mind as much as it once waited across the ice, a reminder that some things are silent, some things are still, and some things follow us long after we think we have left them behind. Story 8. The Abandoned Winter Camp of Hollow Trees. The hike had started as a way to clear my mind, a solitary trek through the high pines of the Appalachian backcountry in the thick of winter. Snow covered every branch, every rock, and the ground crunched beneath my boots with each step. The air was bitter, sharp against my face, but the isolation felt good, just me, the rhythm of my breathing, and the quiet, muted world. I had planned to camp for the night, set up a small tent in a clearing, and spend the evening alone with the wind whistling through the trees. That's when I stumbled upon it. An abandoned winter camp tucked between a cluster of hollow pines, half buried under fresh snow. At first, it seemed ordinary enough. The remnants of someone else's trip. Tents collapsed, poles snapped, a circle of stones that had once held a fire now cold and grey. But as I stepped closer, a chill ran down my spine. The site was untouched, too neat for a camp abandoned in a storm or left in haste. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain why the people had gone. Everything lay in perfect stillness, frozen mid-use. Even the fire pit, blackened and dead, seemed staged in its emptiness. I felt it the moment I entered the clearing, that something was off, more than the cold or the snow, something that made the silence heavy and the forest around me suddenly alert, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I set up my own small camp nearby, pitching my tent with fingers stiff from the cold, and built a modest fire. The flames crackled, throwing jagged shadows across the snow and the skeletal pines. Yet the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, slipping across the trees with a subtle, deliberate motion that my tired mind could not quite explain. Night fell fully, and with it, The forest grew quiet in a way that was different from the daytime hush. It was heavier, anticipatory, as if the world itself had drawn a breath and held it. Then I heard it, faint at first, like the whisper of the wind through hollow branches, but unmistakable. Laughter. Not the easy, human laughter of someone telling a joke, but sharp, brittle, echoing in the hollows of the trees. It didn't match the movement of the snow, didn't correspond to anything I could see. I froze, straining to hear each snap of a branch, each creak of the pines making my pulse hammer in my ears. The laughter came again, closer this time, shifting from tree to tree, circling the clearing in impossible patterns. I scanned the shadows, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and saw nothing. No footprints, no movement, only the hollow shapes of the pines, and yet I could feel eyes, something cold and waiting, following me from every side. My fire seemed to shrink under their gaze, the light inadequate, flickering unnaturally. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, and the laughter seemed to respond, rising in volume, then cutting off abruptly when I moved. It was patient, knowing, deliberate in a way that made me recoil with a mix of fear and fascination. I packed my camp as quietly as I could, stuffing my tent and gear with trembling hands, each second stretching into an eternity. The snow crunched underfoot as I fled the clearing, the hollow laughter echoing after me, bouncing from tree to tree, following me as if the forest itself were alive and amused by my panic. I didn't stop until I reached a ridge where the moonlight cut through the trees, illuminating a familiar trail that led back toward the main path. Even then, the forest seemed to press against me, the hollow pines leaning inward, shadows flicking at the corners of my vision. I didn't look back, not until I reached the safety of my car parked far below, tires crunching over packed snow. The clearing was gone from sight, swallowed by the folds of the forest. Yet I felt the presence lingering, patient, silent, as if it had marked me in some way. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by echoes of hollow laughter and the sensation of unseen eyes pressing against my mind. I kept waking, convinced I could hear the snapping of branches, the subtle shift of shadows through my window. And every time I opened my eyes, the memory of the abandoned camp pressed forward, vivid and unyielding. The snow had erased all evidence of the site by morning, leaving only a faint imprint in my memory of a place that had never existed and yet had been undeniably real. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding winter hikes alone, drawn to the warmth of familiar trails and the comfort of others' company. Even then, whenever I passed through pines heavy with snow, I felt it, the weight of hollow eyes watching from the dark, patient and silent, always waiting. I knew in some part of my mind I could not dismiss that the abandoned camp had not been empty. It had been waiting, a quiet sentinel in the forest. And though I had fled, the echo of that presence remained, trailing me long after the laughter had stopped. Even now in the city, on quiet winter nights, I catch myself glancing into shadows in corners, sensing a weight I cannot place, hearing the faintest flicker of laughter in the hush of the world. The memory follows me like a shadow, patient, deliberate, a reminder that some places in the backcountry are never truly empty, that some forests hold more than trees and snow, and that what waits in the hollow spaces sees more than we ever can. Story 9. The Old Bridge. Groaned in Fros. I had been hiking along an old logging trail in the northern Appalachians, the forest weighed down by a thick layer of frost, each branch glistening like brittle glass in the weak winter sunlight. The trail was deserted, as it had been for hours, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on frozen leaves and the occasional drip of water melting from an overhanging limb. I had been following the path toward a small creek I remembered from past hikes, intending to cross and continue along a less trodden route when I saw the bridge. It was rickety, aged wood stretching across the narrow creek, ice forming along its edges and making each plank slick with frost. I hesitated for a moment, eyeing the gaps between the boards, but the shortest way across was over it. The first step sent a shiver through me, not from the cold, but from the subtle groan that echoed beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was the wood settling under my weight, but the sound was strange, low and resonant, almost like the bridge itself was alive and protesting. A cold draft cut across the narrow span, sharper than the wind anywhere else along the creek, brushing against my neck and making the hairs on my arms stand up. I paused, squinting down at the frozen water beneath me, trying to rationalize the feeling. The creek was shallow here, and yet it looked impossibly deep. Dark water trapped beneath a thin layer of ice that groaned faintly in response to my every movement. As I stepped forward again, I became aware of something beside me, a presence that seemed almost tangible, pressing against my side without touching me. My heart began to hammer, each beat echoing in my ears as if the forest itself were listening. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or my imagination, but there was no movement of branches, no trace of a shadow, only the sensation of being watched, the chill that wasn't carried by the air. I quickened my pace, the frost crunching beneath my boots louder with every step, my breath forming tight clouds in the freezing air. Each plank groaned beneath me, not with the weight of wood, but as if the very air around it whispered, a slow, deliberate moan that seemed to follow my steps. Halfway across, I stumbled slightly, and the groan deepened, vibrating through the boards and up into my legs. I felt an almost physical pressure at my shoulder, the chill intensifying, and instinctively I bolted, running the remaining distance to the opposite bank without looking back. My lungs burned, and my hands shook as I steadied myself, leaning against the frozen trunk of a nearby tree. The forest was quiet once more, only the muffled drip of melting ice in the distance. I dared a glance over my shoulder, expecting some sign of movement, some hint of the presence that had accompanied me, but the bridge stood silent, inert, as if nothing had happened at all. The frost glinted in the weak sunlight, the boards perfectly still, waiting patiently for the next traveler foolish enough to cross. I lingered there for several minutes, my chest heaving, my eyes tracing the length of the bridge, trying to understand what I had just felt. Rational thought offered no explanation. No wind currents could have pressed so sharply against me. No gap in the woods could have accounted for the unmistakable sensation of being beside me. The more I stared, the more the bridge seemed to breathe, as though it were alive in some subtle, unknowable way, waiting to claim attention and fear from anyone who stepped onto it. I felt the urge to flee entirely, to leave the forest and never return, but something rooted me in place. A mix of dread and fascination that kept my eyes fixed on the wooden span. Eventually I forced myself to move, stepping carefully away from the bank, back toward the trail that would lead me home. The groaning of the bridge faded behind me, though the memory of it pressed against my mind as though it were still vibrating through the forest itself. The chill that had accompanied me across the span seemed to linger, a phantom of cold that wrapped around my shoulders long after I had left the creek behind. Every snap of a branch in the distance, every whisper of the wind through the pines, seemed magnified by the memory, carrying with it the same unplaceable weight I had felt on the bridge. By the time I returned to the car, the sun had begun to sink, the shadows stretching long across the frozen landscape. I sat behind the wheel for a long while, staring out at the forest where the bridge disappeared among the trees, and I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, patient, silent, waiting. It had not moved, it had not changed, it had simply endured, a part of the frozen creek in the woods, an entity that measured time differently than I did, that watched and waited for anyone foolish enough to cross its span. That night, sleep was uneasy. I dreamed of the bridge, the boards groaning under my imagined weight, the phantom pressure brushing my side, the frost glinting in the darkness. I woke several times, heart pounding, convinced I could feel that same chill in my room, as though the bridge had followed me, patient and silent, keeping its watch even across distance and time. Rationality told me it was nothing, a trick of nerves and imagination, yet every instinct in me screamed otherwise. Even weeks later, whenever I walk along creeks in winter or cross rickety wooden structures left to the elements, I feel the same weight, the same presence lingering just beyond the edge of vision. I know the bridge is still out there, groaning in the frost, waiting quietly for the next traveler. Patient and unyielding, and the memory of it presses against my mind with a cold insistence I cannot shake. Story 10. The snow-covered cabin of footprints. The hike had begun in earnest that morning, the air crisp and stinging, snow crunching beneath my boots as I pressed deeper into the backcountry. I had planned to explore a seldom-used trail along a ridge I knew only from old maps and occasional markers left by hunters. The sky was low, heavy with clouds that promised more snow, and the forest seemed almost unreal in its quiet, the occasional snap of a branch under a deer's hooves the only sound breaking the stillness. Hours passed, and I found myself stumbling through deeper snow than expected, the trail long vanished beneath the white blanket. That's when I saw it, a cabin tucked against a slope, snow piled high around its roof and eaves, nearly swallowed by the forest itself. At first it felt like a relief. The day had been long, my legs aching from the climb, and the cold was biting through my layers. I approached cautiously, boots crunching in the soft drifts, expecting perhaps a hunter's shelter or an abandoned shack. The door was closed but not locked, and when I pushed it open, I was met with an almost eerie stillness. The air inside smelled faintly of pine and smoke long extinguished. Everything was neat, untouched. Chairs tucked under tables, cooking implements in place. A small stack of firewood neatly arranged. It was as if someone had frozen the cabin in time, gone moments ago, and left nothing out of place. I set my pack down near the fireplace, my fingers trembling more from unease than the cold. And then I noticed the footprints. They were small, overlapping, a strange pattern that led from the kitchen out into the snow beyond the cabin. There were too many, as if more than one person or thing had passed, and all ended at the edge of the woods, stopping abruptly at the same point. I couldn't explain it. The snow beyond the cabin was otherwise untouched, not a single branch displaced, no animal tracks, nothing to suggest what had made them. My mind tried to rationalize it, hunters leaving early, some strange trick of perspective, but the order and abruptness of the footprints made my stomach tighten. I felt a cold draft stir behind me and spun toward the shadows along the walls. The light from the small windows cast long shapes across the floor, but there was nothing there. Still, I could feel it, an almost imperceptible weight in the air, a presence that seemed to press against my back, watching. I wanted to leave, to turn and run, yet curiosity pinned me for a moment, and I considered stepping into the snow to follow the tracks. But something in me, a deep, primal sense, told me not to. Something told me that the end of those prints was a boundary I wasn't meant to cross, that whatever had been here was still present, just beyond sight. I gathered my pack, my movements deliberate and careful, trying not to disturb the neatness of the cabin as if touching anything might draw attention. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the faint whine of the wind against the corners of the roof and the soft creak of the timbers under my weight. I glanced once more at the footprints leading outward. the overlapping impressions a silent warning, a record of motion and presence that the forest had otherwise erased. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stepped outside, the snow deep around my boots, and I felt the chill not just from the winter air, but from the awareness that I was being watched. The woods beyond the cabin were dense, the snow softening my steps but amplifying every sound, every shift of branches overhead. I didn't look back, but I could sense the cabin behind me, dark and silent, as if it were breathing, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to not pause, and yet my gaze kept flicking toward the faint window where shadows seemed to linger, stubborn and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, fatigue, the isolation twisting ordinary shapes into something unsettling, but the prints remained vivid in my memory. Their sudden halt, the impossibility of knowing what had ended them. By the time I reached the trail that would take me back toward the main road, the forest had taken on a different weight. Snow clung to the branches in heavy, glittering drifts, the trees casting long, slanted shadows that seemed to shift with my vision. Every gust of wind whispered against the trunks like a voice carried from the cabin. A reminder that the presence I had felt was not gone, that it lingered just beyond the line of sight. I quickened my pace, my legs aching, lungs burning from exertion and fear both, but I could not rid myself of the thought that something, or someone, still occupied that cabin, silent, patient, and waiting. That night, in a motel miles from the forest, I replayed the image over and over in my mind. The perfect neatness of the cabin, the stack of firewood, the cold light through the small windows, and the footprints frozen in snow, leading nowhere, yet suggesting everything. Sleep was fitful, haunted by the thought of who or what had moved in that cabin, their motion recorded in prints and shadows, a presence that had left no trace except for those impossibly neat paths in the snow. I could still feel it watching, an awareness beyond human measure, patient, deliberate, hidden in the stillness of the woods. Even now, months later, the memory persists. I think of the cabin whenever I hear snow falling on roofs or footsteps crunching softly in a remote winter forest. I picture the footprints in the snow, how they overlap and stop at the same point, the suggestion that something continues to wait in quiet, undisturbed spaces. I haven't returned, and I don't intend to. The idea that the cabin might still be there, untouched and occupied by a silent observer, is enough to keep me away. It haunts me not with spectacle, but with subtle dread, the kind that lingers, patient and quiet, in the corners of memory. Story 11. The Cold Whisper Through Pine Trees. I had been walking home through the forest after visiting a friend on the outskirts of town, the sun long gone and night settling like a heavy blanket over the Appalachian pines. The path was narrow and familiar, a shortcut I had taken countless times, but tonight it felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the woods themselves had grown aware of me. The snow beneath my boots was soft and muffling, but every step seemed amplified in my own ears, the snap of a twig or the creak of a branch stretching unnaturally through the stillness. The cold bit at my cheeks, but it wasn't the wind that made me shiver. It was the sense of being watched, a subtle pressure pressing against my back and shoulders as I moved along the path. I remember the moment it started, faint at first, like the wind playing tricks on me. My name, whispered, urgent, curling around the trunks of the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, my mind echoing the words in the emptiness of the forest. But the whispering continued, deliberate, circling me from every direction. It wasn't carried straight by the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, shifting with my movements, keeping pace with me. I stopped, trying to convince myself I had only imagined it, and for a second the forest was silent again. Then it came, louder this time, low and urgent, wrapping itself around the trees, echoing off the frozen ground and the thick trunks. Panic set in, slow and crawling at first, then urgent as I broke into a run. My boots slipped on frost-covered roots, my lungs burned with each breath, and still the whisper followed, always just behind, yet circling so that every glance over my shoulder seemed to reveal nothing and everything at once. The trees appeared to lean in toward me as I ran, shadows stretching impossibly long, branches clawing at the night. The path twisted beneath my feet in ways I didn't remember, the familiar shortcut feeling suddenly foreign, the snow shifting underfoot as if guiding me somewhere I did not want to go. I called out, hoping my voice might anchor reality, but it vanished into the dark like smoke, swallowed by the frozen pines. I stumbled to a halt near a small clearing, breath ragged, chest tight, every sense straining for a glimpse of whatever haunted me. The whisper came again, more distinct now, deliberate, each syllable stretched and urgent. My name, over and over, carried in a rhythm that matched my racing heart. I pressed myself against a tree, trembling, wishing I could vanish, wishing the forest would take pity and remain silent. But it didn't. The wind, or whatever it was, bent around me, moving the branches in unnatural ways, brushing my hair across my face as though testing the edges of my fear. Minutes, or maybe hours passed. I have no sense of time in that moment. I kept moving, slowly, carefully, eyes wide, ears straining, every shadow seeming to twitch with awareness. When I dared to glance back, the pines seemed to lean closer, watching, patient, silent, yet aware. It was impossible to tell if they had always been that way, or if my mind had made them so in the grip of terror. Every step I took, the whisper followed, circling, urgent, patient, carrying with it the subtle weight of something I could not see but could feel, pressing against the edges of my awareness. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest, the open field that led toward the road just ahead. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the quiet rustle of snow underfoot and the distant hum of lights from houses scattered along the outskirts. I did not pause. I ran across the field, barely feeling the bite of wind against my face, lungs burning, heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the safety of the road, the weight lifted slightly. But the memory of the whisper stayed with me, pressing in the corners of my mind, a persistent echo of the urgency that had followed me through the pines. I never walked that path at night again. During the days, the forest looked innocent enough, trees standing in silent rows, snow glinting softly under the winter sun, but the memory of that night made everything seem subtly wrong. The bend of a trunk, the way shadows pooled beneath branches, the way the wind could carry more than just leaves and snow. On quiet nights when the wind is still and the forest is heavy with frost, I sometimes imagine that whisper returning, circling from tree to tree, patient and deliberate, waiting for someone to wander alone into the pines again. I can still feel it in my bones, soft and insistent, as if it never truly left. A reminder that some paths are not meant to be crossed in darkness, that the forest keeps its secrets and watches with patient attention. Even now, years later, when I walk near the edge of those woods, the memory of that night returns in a heartbeat. The urgency of the whisper, the leaning trees, the sensation of being small, alone, and observed. The fear is not sharp and sudden anymore. It is quiet and persistent, a cold pressure in the chest, a lingering awareness that the forest is alive in ways I cannot explain. I carry it with me, a quiet caution, a subtle dread that reminds me that some parts of the Appalachian woods are not for wandering after dark, that some voices are not meant to be heard, and that the pines themselves may remember you long after you leave. Story 12, The Frosted Window with Watching Eyes. I had arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sky grey and heavy with snow, the kind that blankets everything in silence before the storm really sets in. The road had been barely passable, tire tracks leading in from miles back, winding through thick pines coated in frost. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already begun to slip behind the ridges, casting long, cold shadows across the snow. The place was isolated, more so than I remembered from the map, but I welcomed the quiet. I had intended only a weekend of solitude, a reprieve from work and the city, and the thought of sitting by a fire with nothing but the hiss of falling snow outside was comforting in a way that only deep winter in the Appalachians can be. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit the fireplace, set my kettle on to boil, and moved between the small rooms, unpacking and making the space feel lived in, if only temporarily. The cold air bit at the edges of the cabin, and the windows fogged from the heat inside. I drifted to sleep with the steady creak of the cabin's timbers settling in the cold, the snow pressing against the walls like a quiet audience. It was the second night that I awoke, or maybe I never fully slept. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing down through the cracks in the door and windows. I opened my eyes and saw the frost, thick and opaque, across the window panes. At first, I thought it was just the cold, my mind half dreaming, but then I noticed shapes, tiny, pinprick-like reflections in the ice that seemed deliberate. I sat up, straining, and realized with a sudden and sickening clarity, eyes, human-shaped, unblinking, staring directly at me from the other side of the frosted glass. I froze, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was condensation catching the lamplight or the reflection of the fireplace flickering on the ice. But the eyes remained, patient, waiting, staring with a weight that made my chest tighten. I approached the window slowly, careful not to move too abruptly, my breath fogging the glass in front of me. I reached out, my fingers trembling against the cold pane, and as I pressed closer, they vanished. The frost itself seemed to swallow them, leaving only the opaque white ice and the faint impression that someone or something had been watching just beyond reach. I backed away, rationalizing it, telling myself the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on my mind. Yet sleep did not return easily that night. Every shadow in the cabin seemed heavier, every creak of the floorboard amplified, like the house itself was aware of me, aware that I had noticed. The next night, it happened again. I had tried to convince myself it was coincidence, a trick of light and frost, but when I woke to the same pressing silence, I knew better. The eyes were there, unblinking and patient, hovering just beyond the frost. I approached more cautiously this time, feeling the weight of the winter air pressing against my chest. They did not blink, did not move, yet I could feel them, awareness radiating through the ice as though the forest itself had leaned close to observe me. The sensation of being watched pressed into my bones, cold and unrelenting, and I realized that I was not alone, that the woods beyond the cabin held some presence that had tracked me here, quiet and deliberate. I spent hours that night sitting near the fire, listening to the wind pull through the pines outside, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. The forest was impossibly still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the snow. Every shadow cast by the firelight seemed to pulse with life. I did not sleep well. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the frost, and in it the unblinking eyes, patient, waiting for some unknown moment. By the third night, I no longer dared approach the windows. I sat in the center of the cabin, fire low, eyes wide, alert to the smallest sound. The snow fell heavier, blanketing the clearing and muffling most outside noises, yet I could feel movement beyond the frost. It was subtle, the way a shadow might stretch or a branch might twitch, but it carried intention. A deliberate presence that belonged to no human I knew. I understood then that these were not figments, not reflections of my imagination. Something or someone was watching me from the dark forest, patient and silent as the storm pressed the world into white quiet around me. I left the cabin the next day, packing quickly, not daring to linger. Even as I drove down the icy road, the landscape blanketed in snow and silence. I could not shake the memory of those eyes. They followed me in my mind, unblinking, patient, keeping time with the passing trees and ridges. When I returned home, the weight remained, a cold pressure in the chest, a lingering sense of being observed even in familiar, warm spaces. I never went back to that cabin, and I do not intend to. The memory of those frost-covered windows and the eyes that waited beyond them remains with me, quiet and insistent, a subtle dread that gnaws in the corners of my mind, a warning that the forest remembers and watches those who wander into its winter silence. Even now, years later, when the wind scours the trees in winter, I feel the same prickle at the base of my neck, the same awareness pressing against the edges of my perception. The eyes in the frost have become a symbol of all the hidden, patient presences that linger in the Appalachians, waiting, observing, and reminding me that some solitude is not safe, that some woods are never truly empty, and that some cold, silent watchfulness persists long after you leave.